Welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and once again, joining us, I'd like to say via satellite, but that's not real. We don't have one. Professor Glyn Willaims is with us from UMass Dartmouth, updating us on the conflicts going on across Europe and across the Middle East. It's good to see you, my friend. How are you?
Hey, good, Jim. Good to see you too, and thanks for having me back on again to discuss these interesting events in the Middle East and Russia.
You know, we've been talking about this now for 3 years, and it's hard to believe that it's been this long.
Yeah, it's amazing that it was 3 years ago that Putin stunned the world by storming into Ukraine and launching the largest war in Europe since World War II. And of course, we've seen all sorts of horrific events, including the fact that according to this week's analysis, Russia has had over 1 million casualties in this folly, this invasion of Ukraine. And of those 1 million, 250,000 troops have been killed.
Are you surprised that it's gone on this long? I mean, when you and I chatted, we didn't really know, but are you surprised that it's gone this long?
I'm not. You have an unstoppable force in the form of this megalomaniac Russian leader, a modern-day Hitler, who wants to annihilate the people, the language, the culture, the state of Ukraine, and an unmovable force, these brave Ukrainians who are fighting to preserve their language, their culture, and their democracy for their children and their grandchildren. And neither side really has a motivation to pull back from this war yet. They both see it in their interest to keep fighting. So, it doesn't surprise me that this clash between almost two tectonic plates, the Russian Federation, the largest country in Europe, and Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe, continues, sadly, to this very day.
Are you surprised, though, that there has not been more pressure from the European countries or just from the outside world to try to have a peace agreement?
Yeah, I've been surprised that Macron, for example, or Starmer, or Trump have not been able to have more success in pushing the two sides to come to Istanbul for a treaty and make some real efforts to end this bloody war of attrition that is grinding down both sides. We've seen that there seems to be no real initiative on the part of Russia in particular. They see it to their advantage to keep fighting. So they have no real interest in coming to the table in good faith and negotiating an end to this bloody war that is devastating Russia. They have lost more people than Ukrainians, and their country has been devastated by these sanctions. And we'll see if these tariffs do kick into play that Trump has threatened to launch in 10 to 12 days.
Where is the war right now, though? Where do we stand as far as objective versus, the results right now that we see?
We stand at a stalemate. Putin went in 3 years ago with these grand expectations of breaking and destroying this, what he thought to be a very brittle, fragile democracy. And he has failed in his objective of doing a decapitation strike, overthrowing the Zelensky government, and putting a puppet regime in place. What he has achieved is capturing about 20% of Ukraine, primarily in the east, and holding on to it. And Ukraine has succeeded, against all odds, in grinding down this empire, this transnational state that has the world's second largest military. Ukraine has ground it down in this bloody attrition war and has succeeded in defending its independence and its democracy. And it has some amazing successes. For example, I wrote an article about this. Ukrainians, who have no navy, by the way, succeeded in crushing and defeating the Russians' mighty Black Sea Navy by using naval drones. And they succeeded in really making the Russians pay a heavy price. Putin thought he could conquer Ukraine in 3 days. Here we are 3 years later, and he would never have envisioned, Putin, that he'd lose 250,000 of his people killed in action in trying to destroy this country that by all means should have fallen easily.
One thing that just numbers, you talk about the Russian casualties, but Ukraine has had serious casualties too. But I'm curious you know, is Ukraine running out of people? Because Russia has certainly more people to tap into than Ukraine does. And is that what the end game is for Russia?
Yeah, and to answer your question, yes, Ukraine is running out of young, able-bodied men to hold off these mass human wave. They call them meat assaults, Russian human wave assaults, in which the Russians just they don't care about their own soldiers' lives. They throw them in the tens of thousands across these heavily mined fields with the drones bombing them, and the Russians are able to win by just sheer human mass. They're losing tens of thousands of people every month. They're losing up to 2,000 troops per day, the Russians are. To put that in perspective, America lost just over 2,000 troops fighting in Afghanistan in 20 years. So the Russians are losing that much per day in these indiscriminate mass assaults where their people just get ground down by the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians do lose people defending against these meat wave assaults that storm their positions. And the Russians are making gradual, incremental progress in eastern Ukraine, but at such a heavy cost, no other army in the world would throw its own troops into death, certain death, the way Putin has with his indiscriminate mass human wave assaults that resemble the sort of human wave assaults used back in World War One.
Do you see then, knowing the cost of what Russia is experiencing, do you see that this conflict, could go on because, as you said, there seems to be no interest in a peace, but then ultimately Russia achieves its goal?
Yeah, in some sense, Putin has achieved limited goals. He has acquired the Crimea, a strategic peninsula I lived in and wrote 2 books about. So
But he had that
this
before.
vast-
He had that before the
right. So
launch.
he conquered. Yep, he conquered Crimea back in March and April of 2014, and he's gained control of much of the Donbass, a sort of a coal-rich, energy-rich region in eastern Ukraine that is inhabited primarily by Russians or Russophone populations. And he has, to an extent, bled Ukraine. He's banking that he can just beat them with sheer manpower, outlast them, because Ukraine doesn't have tens of thousands of troops to throw into these human wave assaults. Ukrainians care about their troops. They want them to live. And they're playing a war, in some sense, they can't win a war of numbers. Russia could win not through any better battle strategies because Ukrainians are fighting better than them. Ukrainians are using our arms like the Patriot weapon system that Trump just agreed to give them more of just last week. They're using our Stinger ground missile, anti-aircraft missiles, Patriot air defense systems, HIMARS long-range attack missiles to really punish the Russians. And of course, Ukrainians have been tremendously innovative in using small, off-the-shelf civilian drones to hunt down and kill tens of thousands of Russian troops.
Well, it's amazing how much the drones have dominated this war on both sides. The drone attacks going into Kyiv are still taking place every night. But as you just mentioned, Ukraine is also using drones, and they're probably not as sophisticated as the Russian drones, but they're still using them effectively in Russia.
Oh yeah, they're using fiber optic drones now with a cable flying behind it, so you can't jam it and bring it down. And you're right, the Ukrainians are the ones who did begin this asymmetric drone offensive to hold off Russian human wave assaults. Russia was slow to adapt to drone warfare, but they have taken on drones en masse. And now drones have changed the way we see battle. The Pentagon is now reevaluating how we're going to wage future wars. Can you use armored vehicles or main battle tanks in the way we could before? Or are they now vulnerable to off-the-shelf drones that can hunt armor and destroy them with IEDs the way the Ukrainians did to the Russians when they tried invading Kiev back at the outset of the war?
President Trump recently said that he was giving Putin 10 to 12 days to come to some sort of peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, um, or sanctions will be take place. As you mentioned, alluded to, he talked about supplying weapons to Ukraine through NATO, being paid for by NATO. Um, and we were talking off camera, and I thought it's interesting too, because it does seem as though the president is realizing, Putin talks very nice in conversations, and then he keeps doing what he's doing. And I think people are realizing it's not going to stop.
Precisely. If you go back in time, Trump has been bizarrely accepting and coddling of this modern day Hitler. Trump compares himself to Winston Churchill, who stood up to Adolf Hitler, famously, rallying the British people to fight against the Nazis in defense of their homeland. And Trump has claimed to be a modern day Winston Churchill, but for months and even years now, Trump has been more like the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who came before Winston Churchill and famously appeased Hitler and gave in to Hitler and gave Hitler the right to conquer parts of Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and to absorb Austria. In fact, Trump called Putin, quote unquote, a genius for launching this folly, this invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. And of course, when Trump came to office, he famously ambushed Ukrainian President Zelensky alongside his Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office and accused Ukraine, the victims, by the way, of launching this war, of being the reason for the war and not being grateful to America. And he has really been, warming up and cozying with Putin ever since he came to office, to the point twice the Trump administration has cut off weapons supplies to Ukraine. But he seems to have slowly been ambushed by his quote-unquote friend Putin. And he's seen that Putin, as you say, does sweetly talk to Trump, play up his ego, and massage him to make him, try to see both sides as equal, even though one is clearly the victimizer, Russia, and one the victim, Ukraine. But in the last month, Trump seems to have finally gotten tired of it. He's come on and said, I'm frustrated with Trump. I'm very frustrated with Trump. He's basically playing me. And of course, he met one-on-one with Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Vatican back in late April. And they seem to have had a meeting of the minds. And there's been word coming out that Melania Trump even spoke to the president, to Trump, and said, you can't trust Putin. He's saying one thing to you and milking you on one level. And then the next day, as Trump recently said, Putin bombards Ukraine with these massive assaults, not on military targets like the ones Ukraine's been so successful at achieving, including in this surprise attack on their Russian nuclear bombers back in May, where they ambushed the Russians with these drones deep inside their territory and destroyed 6 nuclear Russian bombers. The Russians have been indiscriminately slaughtering Ukrainian civilians right after talking on the phone with Trump. And he seems to have finally had enough.
Right.
He's finally woken up to the fact he's being played, and he's given these deadlines to Putin, finally, much to the glee of Republicans who are hawks, like Lindsey Graham, who've had this package of sanctions and tariffs that they've been dying to implement on Russia. And Trump has been pushing back on them, holding the sanctions back. But in the last few weeks, we've seen Trump has come full circle. He realizes he's been played by Putin, who is a master talker. He's former KGB, and he's now decided enough is enough. He's done what he should have done, when he first came to presidency, and decided to make Russia pay for launching these indiscriminate assaults that are wiping out thousands and thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Ukraine.
I want to switch to the Middle East, but one last question on this, though. I mean, how do you see the next couple months playing out? I mean, it could change any day, but do you see anything different in the next few months with the conflict?
It all depends on whether or not Trump is just talking and blowing hot air, or if he really has a spine and he's going to enforce these secondary tariffs, which are crucial. We don't have a lot of trade with Russia. So tariffs on Russia no matter if it's 100% or 500%, as Republicans have called for, won't really be too biting on Putin. What is crucial is these secondary tariffs that the Republicans have called for in the Senate on Russia's main oil trading partner, China, and a secondary trading partner, India. If we can smack tariffs on China and India and make them pay a heavy price for buying this cheap Russian oil, and perhaps make them cut off these purchases of Russian oil, because no one else in the world is buying Russian oil. We have these sanctions to punish people for buying Russian oil. If we can really bring China and Russia away from this trade deal, and India and Russia from this oil trade deal, we can then hurt Russia at the pump, at the oil pump, because that's the only thing they have going. John McCain once called Russia a country disguised as a gas station. And if we can make them unable to pay for their war by selling oil to China and Russia, then we can actually make Putin think twice about keeping this war going indefinitely.
Talk now about the Middle East, which we've talked about in the past too. Obviously, the situation in the Middle East and Gaza getting more and more desperate. Israel continues its attack in retaliation for the Hamas attack almost 2 years ago now, when you think about it. And, I know that there's been some European countries, I know France and the UK have said that if there isn't a ceasefire agreement soon there, that they will recognize a Palestinian state. I know that Netanyahu recently said there is no hunger, starvation going on in Gaza right now. It's media propaganda. I'll ask you the same question. Do you surprised that this has gone on as long as it has?
Once again, I am surprised. It takes a while for Trump to get there. It took him months and months, years, to finally wake up and understand what we've all understood all along, that Russia is launching a genocidal war to wipe out Ukraine.
You mean it?
And here
Yeah,
it is
okay,
months.
Yeah.
And here it is months that we have Netanyahu, who's also, by every standard, Israeli human rights groups just today came out and said what's happening in Gaza at the hands of their own government is genocide. The United Nations has called it genocide. I myself was a member of the Association of Genocide Scholars, and we agree that what's happening to this teeny population of roughly 2 million squeezed into a genocidal, rubblized death zone is de facto UN definition of genocide. UN defines genocide. UN defines genocide.
Let me play devil's advocate though. What's the line between Israel defending its interests, retribution for the attack that Hamas started? What is the fine line there between Israel doing what it perceives as necessary to protect their country, which is always under attack? Mm-hmm. And I guess there is a fine line there, though.
Well, I agree. And let's go back to October 7th. Hamas did burst into Israel and butcher, slaughter, maim, torture, and mutilate to death 1,200 people in Israel in the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. Families were burnt alive screaming and their bones fused together. Women were raped and mutilated as they were alive. Let's not forget the horrific animalistic slaughter of peaceful people living in kibbutzes primarily, just across the border from Gaza on October 7th. Israel, by any definition, has the right as a nation to defend its population and to seek retribution. And they have done so. They've done a masterful job under Netanyahu of obliterating Iran's proxy wall all around it. Everybody thought Iran could hold Israel hostage with the threat of all these tens of thousands of ballistic missiles raining in on northern Israel from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, combined with all these Qassam missiles coming into southern Israel from Hamas in Gaza, combined with missiles being fired from the Houthi rebels, who are also pro-Iranian, down in Yemen. and of course, missiles coming in from Iran, which has the Middle East's largest arsenal of missiles. They thought they had Israel cornered, but Netanyahu systematically turned against this axis of allies, this axis of resistance, as Iranians call it. He defeated Hamas first. Then,
but I mean, he would argue Hamas is not defeated yet; they're still there.
Yeah, and on one level, they do argue that they've defeated them pretty bad, but they do realize that there is a residual group still fighting there, even though a recent report says Hamas has lost control of 80% of Gaza to gangs and clans and no longer really controls Gaza. But Netanyahu did, in many ways, break down Hamas leadership and fighting capacity. Then he went after Hezbollah, systematically wiping them out with Operation Grim Beeper, blowing up the beepers and wiping out the Red One elites, and even killing Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in these deadly attacks last September. And then, of course, Iran's main proxy ally, the Syrian Assad regime, fell in December. So that cleared the airspace. And so suddenly, Iran's elaborate billions and billions of dollars worth of proxies who surrounded Israel, including Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas, has been wiped out. And Netanyahu did go after the source of all of this attacks, Iran, in Operation Rising Lion, began on June 13th of this summer. And he destroyed their air defenses and killed a lot of their top generals and scientists. So we've seen Israel act with brutality and strength and masterfully destroy the axis of resistance. That is one thing. And I certainly, as a professor of Middle Eastern history who spent time on the ground, with Palestinians and the Israelis, I can see why Israel did what it did and why even America under Trump joined in and delivered these heavy bunker buster ordinances to destroy Fordos and Natanz.
Although there's still questions about how much damage it really did, but
right. And of course, Trump has made that all about himself. Anybody who questions whether or not there might be some residual capacities, whether it be weaponized uranium or centrifuges, the UN, Atomic Agency believes did survive these bunker buster bombs and Tomahawk cruise missiles delivered Operation Midnight Hammer, and it's somehow enemy of America. But those are bona fide questions about whether or not Iran has really had its entire program neutralized. But the main question is, does Israel have the right to continue to slaughter men, women, and children who are lining up desperately begging for food to survive starvation?
The Gaza Health Ministry just said today, announced that 60,000 are now dead from the conflict, and half of them are women and children.
Right. I saw that. So if you do kill over 30,000 men, women, and children in the name of fighting a terrorist organization, and you're wiping out tens of thousands of people who aren't terrorists, anybody who looks at those images of those children screaming, begging for a bowl of dinner or food or breakfast, just for soup, and you hear these reports every week of these desperately starving people being slaughtered by Israeli troops who gun them down in the dozens and dozens and dozens. All you have to do is look at those images, and when Netanyahu tells you, don't believe your lying eyes, there's nothing happening here. It is a post-Armageddon death zone. They're facing a starvation crisis that is man-made. And by any definition of genocide, the UN defines genocide as an attempt to wipe out in whole or a part of people and to not deny them food and housing. You don't have to try killing the entire people to kill enough of them to meet the threshold for UN definition of genocide. And even Trump just yesterday broke with Netanyahu and came out and said, I'm seeing starvation there. So he's announcing, I see what I see, and the whole world is seeing it. And you have to be living on an alternative universe, alternative world, to believe Netanyahu's claim that there's nothing happening here. Just look away.
We've got a couple minutes left. So one last question on this too. Is Israel isolating itself from the rest of the world by their actions?
Absolutely. Israel dreams of completing the Abraham Accords, which were begun by Trump with such great hope of bringing Israel in out from the cold and having this pariah state of Israel finally recognized by the Arab communities and the Muslim world. We had the Abraham Accords win over support and recognition of Israel from countries like Morocco or Qatar. The holy grail for the Abraham Accords is for Israel to be recognized by the Saudis, who are custodians of Mecca and Medina, the holy places in Arabia. If we can get the Saudis and the Israelis to recognize one another, that will go a long way towards bringing peace in the Middle East. But that's unachievable if the Saudi people turn on their TVs every day and see babies starving to death, people being shot for running and begging to get food that's falling from the air in these trickle-down airdrops. The supplies being given to the Israelis by Israel are not even close to being enough to head off mass starvation. So, Israel is isolating itself. It is portraying itself before the world as being heartless and cruel and engaging in a broad brushstroke genocidal war of displacement and starvation. I mean, they're enabling mass starvation.
But again, the argument on the other side is that they are defending and retaliating against Hamas, which obviously started and attacked Israel. And that's really, and again, that's the fine line, I guess, that's talked about.
Yep. And as I said before, I fully, and I think the world fully supports, most of the world, Israel's legitimate interest in defending its population from the sort of horrors we saw on October 7th during Hamas's brutal mutilation campaign, the Al-Aqsa flood rape rampage into Israel. But I don't think the world is standing by them anymore when they come to these images. They cross the line, as you mentioned, when it comes to indiscriminate assaults, and you have an entire population being deprived of shelter. Gaza looks like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and the population are living in those ruins day by day, trying to survive on handouts. And I don't think the world sees that as a legitimate military operation. In fact, most European countries by now are contemplating recognizing Palestine as a direct way of responding to what they see before their eyes every day with these horrific images of mass starvation coming out of that death zone of Gaza.
We've got to leave it there. That's half hour has gone by very quick. We'll have to get you back on in the fall when we'll see how the next few months go. And as you said, things can change that quickly. So it's great seeing you, and thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jim. Enjoyed it. Look forward to talking to you in the fall.
That's going to do it for this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall, the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.